Hi there, my name's Ben, and we don't necessarily have a question to answer today or to try to unpack today, but we do have something that I like to call cutting against the grain. Thinking as an exercise. More often than not, we have a tendency to group ourselves into tribes, into these herds, and that's not just into these communities, and that's not necessarily a fault. We're very social, so we tend to group ourselves not just physically together. That's why we have big cities and all this other stuff, but we have a tendency to also alter our thoughts to think a certain way or alter our opinions in order to fit in. And I think that while, of course, there is a need for that negotiation, I don't necessarily think that it's all that constructive the majority of the time. I think, if anything, it requires a very, very particular type of thought in order to go against the grain, in that sort of a sense. It could be something that's completely outlandish, out of this world, but that ends up sparking a discussion. What I mean to say by this is that it's important for us to, when we notice ourselves thinking along a particular line, thinking along our particular biases, that we should check it. That's what I mean by thinking as exercise and cutting against the grain. Much like, and forgive me for this analogy, but much like a flank steak, for example, where you can see the grain of the muscle going along. If you cut along it, so if you follow your thoughts, cutting along the grain, right? When you go in to bite it, it's tough, it's not flavorful, it's bland, boring, if you will. Now, when you cut against the grain of the flank steak, of course, that's when you get a nice, juicy, tender bit of meat, and it tastes a lot better. And I think thoughts operate like this. If you constantly go with the grain of your thoughts, within your own bias, within your own perspective, within your own rigid worldview, eventually it's going to get bland. It's going to get tough. It's going to get what's the point of thinking? Why not just turn on the Netflix, and so that way I don't have to think anymore and shut it off? But if periodically we cut against the grain, if we take ourselves outside of our bias, if we take ourselves outside of our perspective, and we think, okay, let me challenge myself. Let me challenge some of my preconceived notions. Let me try to be as perspicacious as possible with my own self. Let me try to unpack some of my bias. Let me try to think in a different way. Let me try to cut against the grain. I think that yields not only a cathartic reaction, but I think that it also yields a much more tender and a meatier thought process. If anything, it is almost like hitting a new exercise for the first time. It is in the way where you're training your mind in order to not be more resilient, but to be more flexible, to be more adaptable, so that way you're able to think in a different way. So when you're confronted with a different perspective, it's not just an immediate walls up, I'm on the defensive, let me go and, shout from my battlements and say, no, your perspective is wrong, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to have my thoughts challenged. Instead, you become very flexible, very adaptable, and you say, oh, okay. It lends your mind to being more plastic. When you're more plastic, you're more accepting of the fact that, okay, yeah, you know what? I am probably either right or I'm wrong about this issue. But that's not but it's not about right or wrong in that sort of a sense. It's about gaining a new perspective, and it's about thinking in a different way. It's about having a light bulb moment and saying, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." It's an interesting thought. Cutting against the grain is the practice not just of thinking as an exercise, but it's thinking for thinking's sake. Right? We're very, very focused on action, and action is very important. I don't want to disregard that. There is a whole thing of paralysis by overanalysis. If you do what I like to call the Hamlet syndrome, when you spend all of your time pondering and none of your time actually doing, your life's going to pass you by. You're not going to end up achieving the goals that you want. But I think that from time to time, we should just think for thinking's sake. It's not just to to spur us into action, but by just thinking and receiving a new perspective, and by trying to solve that problem on your own, I think that lends a much, much better and a much cleaner thought process, if that makes sense. Now, I think that not a lot of people do this. I've only recently started doing it. For me, it has very much helped me to be a little bit more perspective, to have a little bit of a more open perspective on different issues. I think, again, because in the past, and my friends and people who know me will say this, I had a tendency to be very, closed-minded, my way or the highway, in the sort of sense that you can almost bully a conversation. Or you have a tendency to be very, very passionate and stick to your guns. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, because sticking to your guns is very, very important. And I think that there's a time and a place to stick to them. You have to choose your hill to die on. It's the only way. However, it is also imperative that we do keep as open of a perspective as possible. So then that way, who knows? You can learn of many other hills that you can choose. Maybe there are perspectives, maybe there are thoughts, ideas that you haven't been exposed to that are going to trigger something in you. And they're going to think, you know what? Maybe this is what I want to pursue. It shapes your brain in a different way when you're exposed to this stuff. And I think that ultimately it's more beneficial to everybody. So a couple of things that I do in order to help cut against the grain, if you will, is number one, I do my best to, if I have a preconceived notion or if I have a position, the first thing that I do is to try to argue the opposite of it. Play the contrarian, the devil's advocate, with yourself first. The reason why I do this is because not to shoot, in debate, a lot of people have a tendency to shun the devil's advocate because, debates unfortunately now sometimes get a little bit too personal. But if you come at the contrarian perspective and playing the devil's advocate, if you're trying to cut against the grain, you're not doing it to harm the person, you're actually doing it to help to strengthen their argument. So that, because the way that happens is that when you play the devil's advocate, let's say with yourself, if I do it with myself, I'm finding the holes in my own argument. I'm saying, okay, that's a weakness right there. Or you know what, the logic doesn't necessarily follow there. It's not sound in this area either. It helps me when I have an opinion or when I have a thought to say, okay, If I argue it from the other side, I'm doing this so that way I can strengthen my own point of view. Or if you're doing it with somebody else, you're helping it to strengthen their point of view as well. So that's the first thing that I do, is play the contrarian. Second thing that I do is to, this is going to be, I guess, kind of ironic for someone like me, my friends might laugh, is to shut up and to actually listen. To not have the first and the last word. The reason for that is because if you're always thinking about, okay, like immediately what I'm going to respond, how am I going to respond, I have to have the first word, the first say and the last say, because then everything else in between doesn't necessarily matter. That lends itself to, okay, it's already crystallized in your head. Your thought's not going to change. There's no, like, I mean, you're cutting with the grain. That is a tough task to keep going at it. And there's absolutely no possibility to cut against it. So number 2, it's very, very important, very, very important to, be quiet, let people have their say, reflect on it for a little bit, and then you go ahead with with what you have to say. Because unfortunately, most people have a tendency to wait for their turn to speak instead of actually listening. This is something that I'm still trying to work on, and it's something I think everyone else should try to work on too. Those are the two main aspects that I use. Those are the two main exercises that I like to do. I like to think that it helps to keep my perspective fresh. It helps me listen, and conversely, it gives my words more value when I've let the other person express themselves, and people are more likely to do me that same courtesy. Number 3 is to not take it personally. Don't take a thought, an opinion, a debate, cutting against the grain personally. No, it's not a vindictive attack. If it is, okay, we're talking about a particular thought. It doesn't necessarily. It's everything is all in the ether. There's no place for personal attacks. It's not. No one's trying to say your perspective's bad or your perspective's good, depending on what you're talking about, of course. There are plenty of conversations where someone's perspective could be very, very bad or very, very good in that case. And it's just really, really, it's important to try to, even though we don't have bodies, we are bodies. So which means that our emotions are just as much a part of us as our flesh and our blood is. We can't necessarily let them control us to an extent where you get heated at everything that comes in and challenges you. So those are the 3 things that I like to do in order to help to cut against the grain and to think as exercise. So now I put the question to you. How do you use thinking as exercise? If so, how do you do it? Let me know what your thoughts were in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching.